Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Today is Sunday, May, right? This is the month of May, 26th, 2019. And this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, whatever's been growing. We'll have to find out if this rain is good or bad, too much, too little for prairie plants and things that we care about, and whatever else Dave has been up to for the last week.
Tomorrow is Memorial Day. We need to remember the people who have been out there and have lost their lives supporting what we believe in. Some recent close proximity encounters. Dick Burwash went back to Normandy just before he passed, and Susan Taylor had a brother that was lost in France. So these are personal associations where you remember more specifically because you know people involved. But this week was also strong on people who had passed just recently, and I like to go to these memorial services because it's a time when you meet with friends and relatives and you reminisce, and this is often the last time that the families will get together where you are involved. It's so the first one is Terry Denny. And Terry was a fun-loving person and a professor of education. He transmitted that sort of fun-loving encouragement to students and associates. He was also very perspicacious. He was observant, and he was also, according to the reports, that the Temple Buell Center, which was architecturally nice, but in a friendly way, he was referred to as an SOB because he would be able to zap you before you even knew about it, and would laugh if you didn't have a quick response. This memorial service was Phyllis, his wife, who I remember from her who was singing very nicely, and the children. I knew mostly Todd and Wendy. They were at the Ed 2. It was an informal education school, sort of put together by Freddie Schrumpf, Bill Garn, and Don Kurtz. And they were an energetic bunch, and they dealt with people who didn't quite fit into the regular school system. And they did things like took off on a field trip that was ecological to the Big Bend of Texas and wrote a trail guide that is still used by the federal park district. Just people who had wanted to have a little freedom, perhaps didn't quite fit into the system. So I encountered Terry there and knew him well. And so I was pleased to go to his memorial service. He was, I get impressed that he and others got together in the College of Education, but across the university, where we have professors that are really mentors, and they do a lot to take people to a different level when they're not so sure. And we have to give the university credit for doing that and allowing these sorts of people to be involved. I'm thinking of the College of Education with Tom Hastings and Stake and others who, Bieberman, who put together frameworks that allowed students to mature. He had been a brotherly friend to a number of black people that accepted him as brothers and sisters, and they spoke highly of his support, whether they were students or faculty members. The venue was in the Temple Buell building, which is a building where architects and landscape architects and planners get together in a framework that is in a building that is nicely architecturally organized, with a foyer or an open space where people could join and commune with each other, and a little on the informal side, which was very much Terry. He loved to go fishing. He went to that retreat in Wisconsin, I think, and so had other family associations, including people that I spoke to and enjoyed. Perino is the name I was trying to think of. The Perino family was close. He was an excellent fisherman, and he taught others how to fish. And so we say goodbye to Terry, but a lot of his influence will stay around and continue through the years. The next memorial service that I went to was for Kay Aston. Kay Aston was head of the student for TESOL. It was second language. English is a second language. And that was a department that she was in charge of. I was sitting in a pew with a person who had graduated with English as a second language, and Kay had him in Iran when the Shah was in charge, and they barely had time to get out of there before there was a change in more or less a country revolution, and Kay had to negotiate getting out of there too. They had people in Puerto Rico and other places, and she was an innovative head of department with a PhD from Bryn Mawr, and but she was born in England, in Cambridge, and her parents migrated to Kansas, and Kay, until the last little while, could perform a Kansas football fight song or recite a war cry that she had with several female friends when she was growing up. Kay was very formal and Catholic in basis, and a devout person. And the funeral gave that sort of sense, and I think everyone appreciated that. There was a lot of symbology, and Kay was very much into that. She wasn't tied to that totally, because she would support other causes that didn't involve her particular church interests, but her overall interest. She had people who were part of a support team. Susan Taylor did a lot to caretake for Kay, and so did Rachel Manuel. They had a Plato language lab in the basement of the foreign language building, and a team of active people. And to some extent, some of those principals went to other institutions. I rode with Pat Owens. Pat Owens, we talked, and Pat was belonged to a family of Owens funeral people, and the funeral was being handled by the Owens Funeral Home locally, but they were not related. But he understood the objectives, and the pair of us were part of the pallbearers at the St. Mary's Cemetery. Church people were there, nuns and priests, and the setting in the Newman Foundation was very elegant and appropriate. The hymns and singing was also appropriate, but very different from Terry's memorial, but totally appropriate. I got to, in a short time, as a funeral cortege was being organized, I got to talk to Pat Owens, and we may even visit, but we were exchanging ideas about all sorts of things. He came back from Iran and took on jobs that were more lucrative, but he came from not Muncie, but I'm thinking of the cheese, Munster, Indiana. So a lot of these experiences were reminisced at food and getting together afterwards. And so just moving around and talking to people who had known Kay and in her various places. She enjoyed being at country clubs and would entertain people at country clubs, and she actually lived there. Her last residence was in the Inman Hotel, which she regarded as her home, and that's where she passed. But she was a fun person, and a little bit like Terry, she could anticipate who you were and undercut you with an interesting comment that was good for a laugh. And so Kay was 101, which was a long life. She still had a sister had passed, Sister Mary, and her relatives were few, but she still had contact with farmland in Kansas, and we will remember Kay, and she too will contribute to our thoughts in a more formal way. More suddenly and recently, John Miller, who has been police chief at Monticello for 17 years, a very friendly fellow, and his family owned a plot of land near to our railroad right-of-way Prairie at Monticello, and I had encountered him with that sort of interest. He retired in 2012 and then took on being a trustee for Monticello and was a team player, and he and his wife, Karen, were very much involved in that community. He had grown up, born in Cisco area, and grown up in, was in the Army for, as a law enforcement person, but also a teacher of law enforcement for many years. Came back to be at Decatur for a while, and then Argenta for a while, and then to Monticello. And police chiefs in places like Monticello gives plays a character, and you have to know that Monticello is perhaps a bedroom community for Champaign-Urbana to some extent, but it also has an independent and interesting character. It had a Pepsin factory, and there is history there, and there's a Sangamon River and Lodge Park, and that was where John was involved. I almost felt like playing Ave Maria after that, just to separate that topic from what are other things I want to say. Spring is merging into summer, but we have lots and lots of rain. So we have to consider the problem of climate change. The climate is actually moving much faster than the scientists who predicted it. Ron Sleater and I went to Pope Prairie and Rantoul. He was herbiciding teasel, and I was taking out trees, and underneath those trees there was prairie growing but lacking light, so I was liberating those plants. We have an old interurban bed there with a couple of little bridges that David helped to put in, and they helped me to take photographs in that area without getting my feet into water. I do use, and so does Ron, use Blucher or Wellington boots because the ticks don't get access so easily. I did get one tick, and but it makes prairie a little harder to preserve because it's not easy to differentiate it from weeds, and it's not as easy to hug as a tree, but it's 94% of our local area was prairie, not trees, and it behooves us to preserve those sites. A lot of information involved is like a library that you have never read. And if we're down to 0.01% of the remnant prairie in this county preserved, we have to figure that there's information there that will be needed in 500 years. That's if we're around that long. Some people at the moment are looking at ants. Ants have the strange capacity of, if there's something untoward or something interesting, that within moments the rest of the crowd of ants can know what they're supposed to do. So crowd people that want to know how to send vehicles in a different direction or crowds in a different direction quickly don't know how to do that. Perhaps the ants have pheromones that travel, but without that opportunity to research those animals, we may miss the opportunity to discover something that was useful, or may be useful. It may not be. We have to do research. That's what biological people do. By 1930s, we didn't really have a soybean crop until people went around the world and collected glycine plants and bred rhizobacteria. And so the same sort of situation where you need that library of bacteria, soils, microorganisms, butterflies, and birds and bees. So on our way back from the Prairie and Rantoul, we passed several really extensive plots of yellow. We figured they were weeds, but it's almost like you see in other countries. It might be canola or something like that. That's a useful plant. This is a weed. I later went to check on it. It's not a mustard. Mustard belongs to the cruciferous family, and there's 4 petals. This particular plant has perhaps 15 or 20 petals, and as far as I can find from the nearby farmers, it has a very fine seed that blows extensively. So at the moment, the north end of the Yankee Ridge moraine tails out and gets lower and lower, but it's still higher than the Route 45 that parallels it. The water that has come with constant rain impounds on the top of this moraine. So you have to sort of imagine that there are perched water tables under there that are higher than the lower land around, but they retain the water. The farmers have almost been forced to plow these fields for corn because corn takes a longer time to grow. they haven't planted their soybeans yet. But the difficulty is when your soil is damp, you have compaction of the machinery that you're planting with. One way of avoiding that compaction is to have two dual wheels on either side of the tractor so the weight is spread, but it's still a little difficult to go into damp soil and plant. But that's the dilemma at the moment. The fields that are left and covered with the yellow weed are still very damp with water sitting there. It has to raise the question of, is there a climate change? Climate change can be influenced by humans and what they do, but overall we are part of a universe, and over the centuries, over the millennia, we have had changes in climate which are serious enough to exterminate the dinosaurs. And we have to think about whether we as humans might also be extincted unless we can do something to control small aspects of climate. The Arctic and Antarctic circles are melting at a very rapid rate, and much more quickly than was anticipated or predicted. Yet there are still people who deny that that is happening or don't want to know that it is happening. But the water that's provided will raise the level of the oceans to the point that many of the low-lying places in the universe will be inundated. You see this has happened over the years in Venice. You have buildings built on top of buildings where the water has gotten more, has risen higher. But there are other cities that have been inundated by the water level changes. These are huge changes, and you have those plates that move around the world, and certain creatures survive those changes. We have cockroaches that go back for many, many years, and other creatures. But over the years, climate has changed to the extent that if you have moraines, you have the climate at a certain point, at a certain time, the continental glaciation will deposit there. If the world warms up, then the next deposit for perhaps 1,000 years will be further to the north. If the world gets cooler, it will be to the south, and you will change the nature of the vegetation, and the underlying plates that move will gently change your existence. You have to think about this, and can you control it some? Well, in the last century, humans have managed to put out a lot of carbon that has really changed the situation of climate, specifically so that there is sublocal organization. And so seaside places like Miami or in Shanghai or even New York are going to face what they should do. Should they put a wall around New York, that is almost a disaster for ecology, because once you put a wall, you're not going to have the relationship of one ecological institution to another. You need those mangrove swamps. You have to consider the flow of salt water versus fresh water. It's going to be axiomatic that we can't really save the soul of those flatlands that sometimes are only 6 feet above the present sea level. So we have to think about what we have to do. And one of the problems is that in the past, if you had a small number of people in the world, and the climate changed, you could move. You didn't have a lot of possessions. You didn't own a house. You didn't own that bridge down the road. You could move. But as populations have increased, then you're going to get a lot more people to move. So do you move the whole of New York to a higher zone? But the higher zones are now occupied. So one of the problems is that there's just too many people in this world, and so we have to do something to make sure that we educate people about the problem. It's often not understood. And that includes at the political level. There's still national interests that don't recognize that climate change is a reality. It's enough to say about the farming situation, but it's very unfortunate at the moment. And if those crops don't grow effectively, then there is a crisis in terms of income. And there's also the current crisis of political maneuvering as to who sells what to whom. And so we're not in easy times. I went to meetings this week. I went to the Grand Prairie Friends. The Grand Prairie Friends has been doing very well. They have prairie as well as forests, and they've tended to morph into forest preservation. But part of our reason was to announce a paper that was written by a natural history survey person, and it documented the herpetology of our Pope Prairie and the wider corridor to Paxton. They put down sheets of plywood to see what might be underneath, whether it's a snake or a salamander or a turtle. And that paper is exactly what I'm talking about. So I was talking to the Grand Prairie Friends to suggest that we do that sort of thing with other parts of the ecology, whether it be the butterflies or the small mammals or the bacteria in the soils. The Grand Prairie Friends is celebrating donations and large numbers of volunteers, and I think they're very pleased with themselves, and they deserve to get those accolades. At the Forest Preserve meeting, I was talking more to the width of trails. And when we're down to 0.01% of the remnant prairies we have, when we start to put in a trail that is saving railroad beds, but the Federal Surface Transportation Board does not specifically suggest a wide trail. That's coming from state and federal money, other monies than the Rail Banking Act. On the trail from Urbana to Danville, which is 25 miles, the first phase has been made so wide that there is no remnant prairie there. And that remnant prairie was on the sides of the Big Four that came through that area, and since the yards for the Big Four was in Urbana, the early ecologists, Shelford and Vestal and Kendi, and behind that Coles and May Watts, who suggested that some of these abandoned railroads should be preserved for their habitat as well as for trails. So I think some of those people would be rolling over in their graves because we are losing, or have to, the situation where we can take out some of the last remaining remnant prairie that we have. It's not all that good, but it's all we have, and we need to document it. But you can't document it easily in just 1 year. You need to have a time to cover seasons, to cover rainfall, to cover changes, because the dynamics will change. I'm not sure we're going to get the opportunity to do that because the Forest Preserve has the right to allow recreation to supersede preservation. They're also involved in preservation. They are planting reconstruction prairies, but the reconstruction prairies do not have the biodiversity that of 10,000-year-old remnant prairie. So what can we do about this? Can we convince the general public and the donors to do battle with EPA and ADA to reduce the next phase to a narrower trail? It will take a lot of internal fortitude to make that change. That means you have to question EPA. They are aware there's a little bit of creosote in the leftover underneath the ties, so you cap that with perhaps 6 or 8 inches of gravel. Then you go down the sides because there might be some creosote down the sides. So then you have to balance restoration against recreation. And there's always the question that let's compromise. But when there's nothing left, there's no compromise. We've had to deal with that same sort of situation in Monticello, where it's very tempting to put in a highway adjacent to a highway. And that is what happened with the first segment of the Kickapoo Trail. If you are researching bumblebees and getting a PhD and looking at dwindling supply of bumblebees that are pollinators. And then if you're at Urbana, there's very little chance for connectivity. That creature cannot bounce from place to place. I was very pleased with the plant sale, which brought in something like $15,000. And every time somebody walks out with a few plants, you're providing some connectivity. So I hear listening, but I also hear the need for people to recreate. And the roads are kind of wonderful. I grew up with dirt roads, gravel roads, that were one lane wide. And you often had vehicles with fairly high wheels, so that when you saw a car coming to you, you got off to the side with one wheel in the ditch, and they had one wheel in the ditch, and you passed. Well, when you come to East Central Illinois with some of the most wonderful soils in the world, you have highways everywhere. And surely they allow people to move fast, but there's an occasion when it should be that bicycles should be able to travel on existing roads without being killed. And so we have quite a bit of education to do about how we need to put in a special trail adjacent to a highway and make it so wide that it destroys the nature that is there. So that was my question at Forest Preserve, and I will probably continue to say that, because we're lacking the gene pool that we will need in the future. There were some interesting events this week. The main one was the Humane Society had occupied the vacated Rogards Center just on the end of Market Street, just a few hundred yards away from Weft. And this is a very big sale. The week before, Thursday and Friday, people are invited to bring their materials that they could share. And then on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, people were allowed to buy. There was an entrance donation. For Friday, it was $5. For Saturday, it was $3, and for Sunday, I think it is $1. And so it's still on today. And then at the end, there's a half day, I think it is, free for all, so that the materials don't have to be trashed or taken elsewhere, the leftovers. But people were enjoying themselves. I was behind someone who picked up something in a big box, and I don't know what it was, but they'd researched on the internet, and it was worth $200, and they got it for $40. Wow. So there's a sort of a hurrah as they were going out. But there are a lot of smaller things. It's also very friendly. You keep meeting with people that you know, and so the funds go to the Humane Society and the dogs and cats that we all enjoy. So if you have a chance to go today, the event is still there. There was, I might add that there were a lot of volunteers who were helping people to price the materials, to put them into sections. So all the holiday things were in one section, the kitchenwares in another, the clothing in another, the pet things and garden things in another, and then long lines of people lining up to pay for what they've picked out, and a checkout to see that the materials were paid for. So Mayor Payne and Jim Payne and a whole bunch of other volunteers put this event together, and I applaud their efforts because it's a big deal, and I don't know how much they will gain from that. I'm sure that they will give a boost to the Humane Society. A much smaller event was the Iris show in Lincoln Square, and I assume it's still there. But people breed irises. It once goes back to those eras when irises were called flag lilies, and they were the original flag lilies. There are people who spend their lives breeding these flag lilies to very elegant specimens. You couldn't do that if you didn't have the original flag lily. And that points up the need for us to keep the gene pool active. We watched the gene pool. The 2nd Street dig extends to a Scott Park, and Scott Park has a nice little reconstruction prairie, but it has been planted to Golden Alexander. Golden Alexander is one of the few species that comes early in the spring, and it provides color to the prairie. But in this case, it's excellent. So if you're wandering around the big dig on 2nd Street or the detention pond, then you might take a walk through the Scott Park. The boneyard moves diagonally across, and it is well planted, and the seed can be harvested for other sites that don't have Golden Alexander. In fact, the 2 city-owned detention ponds have hardly any, and there's a contrast there. There is actually a low spot on University Avenue on 2nd Street, which is a formerly organized landscape prairie with a lot of flag lilies in the middle. And they're growing well. It takes, this plot is on top of 2 or 8-foot pipes that take the boneyard under University Avenue. So it's an artificial prairie on top of a concrete waterway. But locally associated, there are trails that can be used by bicycles, and people are beginning to enjoy that whole area. The city and the leadership here of Leslie Mitchell have burned the area, and the plants are saying thank you because it allows heat and light to get into the plant earlier in the spring.
You have 6 minutes.
Okay. So visit the area and enjoy it. I want to say something about the friendship of people and the fact that we have a center on Market Street, which is we joined when the mall was being attractive and everyone was leaving the old city to go to the malls. So we, along with Weft, occupied some of that dead central business district on Market Street. And we've been there for some time, 35 years in fact. And but people come along and they look at the things we do and they ask questions. And so in the last few days, we've had a number of people who are aware that we've lost the pocket prairie across the road, but it has been moved to the 2nd Street dig, and it's a little difficult there because although prairie was wet, like flag lilies were wet, but they can't stand having their roots waterlogged for long periods of time. And so we've lost a few of the plants that couldn't stand that. And when we plant in, I bought from the sale some spiderwort that is fairly tough, and I'm interested to see if it can handle the water. But we had a thunderstorm last night, and that water will be captured in those ponds. It will save you rowing a boat down Green Street when it gets there. So the water will be let out slowly. There are waterfalls, and it's a wonderful place to be. I've got a few moments. I wanted to say that Laurie Coe has done well with the Parkland College has advertised her course where she's teaching people how to do upholstery. And so there's a front page picture of one of her students and some of the upholstery, and then there's a nice little article that invites you to be a part of that opportunity to take that course. I have to say that it's rather wonderful that we have a Parkland College that that allows us to have a whole slug of applied courses where you can learn about welding, you can find out about overseas trips, you can talk about labor relations, you can talk about biology, and it recently ran a recycling opportunity. There's agricultural buildings and agricultural programs, and we really honor the fact that we had that. It started off with its buildings in downtown Champaign, and then moved to Bradley Avenue, where it exists and does a wonderful job, whether it's theater or people starting an idea and continuing it. Laurie worked with the course that was provided and learned the trade, and that has become a part of her career. And so she now is teaching, and we encourage what Laurie is doing.
1 minute.
I just got a call from a guy who is a township supervisor, Doug I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but he's an engineer that works with roadside reconstruction, and he has called to identify some plants. But it impresses me that he preserves, and when he has to mitigate, that means replace vegetation after making a road scar, he pays attention to that. And actually, at the state level, Stephanie Dobbs has done a lot to help preserve roadside corridors, and it's saving the state some considerable amount of money in terms of not having to mow. So I think we're getting to the end. This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And as always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.